I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to a special video conferencing edition of the New York Times Close Up. We're focusing the full program on America's racial reckoning in the aftermath of the death of George Floyd, an unarmed Black man while in the custody of 4 Minneapolis cops. The world watched the horrifying video of a cop with his knee on Floyd's neck for nearly 9 minutes. Floyd is heard on the video repeatedly saying, "I can't breathe." That officer has been charged with murder, the other 3 charged with aiding and abetting murder. The Floyd killing is hardly an isolated incident. Eric Garner, killed by police chokehold on Staten Island. Breonna Taylor, an EMT, killed by Louisville police during a no-knock raid on her home. Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old boy carrying a toy gun, shot to death by a Cleveland cop. The list goes on. But it was the Floyd killing that set off major Black Lives Matter protests, with hundreds of thousands joining in, including many whites. Most of the protests were peaceful, but some turned violent and into a vehicle for looters. The Times says Black Lives Matter may be the largest movement in U.S. history. We're starting to see changes, some of them significant, some symbolic. New York and other cities have banned chokeholds and taken other steps to reform their police, including budget cuts. Mississippi removing the Confederate emblem from its state flag. New polling points to a broad shift in attitudes toward race. NBC Wall Street Journal poll finds 56% think American society is racist. A Washington Post ABC poll finds 69% think Blacks and other minorities do not get equal treatment in the criminal justice system. Is the shift in white attitudes toward racism a passing phase, or have we reached a real inflection point? And what would a true reckoning with racism in America look like? We're joined by Mara Gay, a member of the New York Times editorial board, John Eligon, a national correspondent to the Times who covers race, and Nikita Stewart, a metropolitan reporter for the Times. She covers social services. She's also the author of Troop 6000, the Girl Scout troop that began in a shelter and inspired the world. Now, anybody looking at this from the outside, from far away, would say, isn't this a little bit of deja vu? I look back at the clips, and if you go back to 1930, after 4 years of nagging by W.B. Du Bois, the New York Times finally capitulated, updated its style to capitalize the N in Negro. And the Times said editorially, it's not merely a typographical change, it is an act in recognition of racial respect for those who have been generations in the lower case. This sounds like a lot like our decision this past month to capitalize the B in Black. So John Eligon, what has actually changed in the 90 years since then?
It's funny that you point that out because a lot of the stuff is repeating, right? A lot is repeating. Now, clearly there have been changes, there has been certain progress, but I think the underlying systems in place in which Black and brown people are essentially at a disadvantage, in which the white supremacy is really at the heart and the root of many systems in America. I think that is still there, and I think the way that we're really seeing a reckoning with it right now comes through the form of police and the form of police violence. And I think what I'm seeing on the horizon right now is a shift in thinking about policing and thinking about criminal justice that, while there is still a lot to be done, there's been a lot of talk, a lot of, people saying, hey, we now support Black Lives Matter, a lot of people talking about it. You're seeing it in all athletes on their jerseys and then taking knees and things like that. But I still think, when it comes to that moment of reckoning in terms of, really creating systemic change, I think that's still to be determined whether we're going to take the steps, especially in such a politically divided country, whether the necessary steps are going to be taken to really make change.
Mara Gay, Susan Rice wrote an op-ed piece in the Times where she said this incipient movement risks being reduced to a fleeting instant of heightened consciousness, one that dissipates in the fog of pandemic, economic recession, and a bitter presidential campaign. You've obviously written a number of editorials and notebooks trying to keep this issue alive. Why is this moment different from all the other times that we thought were moments of change in our history?
Well, I think that it's important to recognize that nothing is guaranteed. And I would say that all of these moments are opportunities. And I think the moment that we're in is really no different. So progress wasn't guaranteed in the 60s either. It wasn't guaranteed during the Civil War. We're at a very similar moment. And I think what will make the difference is if the Black Lives Matter movement and just folks who want to see the country be fairer and more equal are engaged politically. It's going to be about voting. It's going to be about protesting. It's going to be about an increase in civic participation at the local, state, and national level, about a change in leadership in the White House. It's going to take years of sustained activism and civic participation to make some progress here. But I think it's a hard thing, because you really have to be able to hold two concepts in your head. One is the idea that, as John said, and I think he's spot on, the same inequality and racism that was embedded in American institutions 150 years ago, we still have structures that are built that way and built on racism. But at the same time, we also have made progress. And so I think it's very, you want to be careful not to be nihilistic or cynical about these moments, because, for example, I mean, my father drank out of a segregated water fountain. He went to segregated schools. So to say that there's been no progress or that these moments don't matter is also not quite right.
Nikita, you've written about the fact that so many white protesters have joined in this movement. Of course, there were plenty of whites who joined in the movement in the 60s in the civil rights movement. But you've also raised the question, is this just a trendy thing? Ross Douthat at the time said, if the avowed intention of the movement is to challenge, as he said, white fragility, yet lots of white people seem strangely enthusiastic about the challenge. So what is this all about? Is it trendy? Is it anti-Trump? Or is there something different going on, whether it's years of collective accumulated guilt or something that suggests a real change in the offing?
There are a lot of different factors. Just like, in the 1960s, when the public could finally see on television, in photographs in newspapers, they could see leaders like John Lewis being beaten, being hosed down. And there was an understanding that, okay, now I really understand racism. And this time around, for some reason, it took that George Floyd video of watching a man. I mean, if you watch the video, you watch, the life being taken out of him. And it really affected people of all races and ethnicities. And finally, white people took to the streets. And for a lot of people, this was building. So you had several books, you had just an awakening, especially in the Trump era, where we have a president who has created divisions and plays those up. And so there were plenty of discussions countering that his narrative. And so a lot of people were already building to this. And then when they saw that video, they took to the streets. Now the question is, what does that look like after people stop marching in the streets? And it's one thing when you're like, I'm against police brutality against Black people. It's another thing when you say, maybe my school district is too white. Maybe I should think before I say my child can't go to that school because there are too many poor Black and brown children at that school, and maybe it's bad. And so I think that is where, that's how we move forward in this moment.
John Eligon, you pointed out in the Times that in our race-related team, the team that writes the newsletter that people can subscribe to at nytimes.com, there was considerable debate over using the term Black and capitalizing the term Black and how Black people should be referred to, as there has been for probably 100 years, whether they were colored, Negro, Black, or whatever, and people still disagree over that. What was that debate like within the group?
Well, I think, it was one of those things where I feel like the opinions were really varied widely. And I think part of it was a question of how much did people emphasize that as like the thing that they want to be talking about right now. I think many people acknowledge that, hey, there is a certain, capitalization does kind of a certain recognition of a shared struggle, of a shared history of Black people, whether people of African descent, regardless of where you are at on this planet. So I think there was that certain acknowledgement. But I think for some people, it was a question of whether, in a time when we're still seeing, very segregated schools, when housing is still segregated, when Black and brown people are still being, brutalized by police at alarming rates. Is this question we want to tackle right now? And I think there's also the sense of you don't want to necessarily let white people, for lack of a better word, get away with thinking that, hey, capitalization, we're capitalizing it now. And an institution like the New York Times, do we just get away with capitalizing? And then that's how we say, look, we're making progress, And I think that that's also part of the sentiment too.
As we did 90 years ago when we capitalized Negro.
Yes, exactly.
Mara, you've been holding everyone's feet to the fire quite correctly on this issue. But the Susan Rice piece in the Times talked about the fact that what we need to do is invest sustained attention, she said, in creativity, sufficient resources, in broad-based initiatives to address the stark, stubborn inequalities that permeate not only the criminal justice system, but also education, economic opportunity, healthcare, housing, and environmental equality. What does that mean? I mean, what in fact can be done in those categories to actually dismantle institutional racism? Is this a factor of human nature? Is it institutional, something that will take generations to break down? Or are there in fact concrete steps that can be taken right now, over the next months, over the next immediate years, to actually change what's going on, to change attitudes, and to change the way our country thinks and acts about race?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's really important for Americans, especially white Americans, to understand that the world that we live in, the country that we live in, the inequalities that we live with, and the racism that we live with didn't just happen. It actually took sustained government action to create, and you can actually take sustained action from government and civil society and social society to break it down and build something that looks more like the country that we're all trying to kind of live up to, or to the country's ideals. So you see that, and I would just encourage folks to just do some reading. There are many great books to be read on these subjects. But for example, the GI Bill, right, in the 1950s, which was actually implemented in a way that excluded Black Americans from becoming a part of the middle class. So those were sustained systemic policies that shut Black Americans out of the wealth that you create through home ownership with FHA loans in the suburbs. It shut them out of good schools, so to speak. And so those are actually concrete actions that have happened in the lifetimes, the living lifetimes of those that are around us that have helped create the inequalities that we see today. And so I think it's really important that we just recognize this is really about political will and social will. It's not about not knowing how to fix this or what the solutions are. I'm not a policy expert, but I can tell you that we've known since the Kerner Commission in the 60s, as you probably know, Sam, exactly what needs to be done to make policing fairer, but we haven't done it. We know how to integrate schools, it's not always done because there's no political will to do it. So these are really actionable goals. And I also just want to say that, you know, the ultimate measure for me, and this is, maybe it sounds pie in the sky, but I think it's really important that we think big. The measure is whether a Black child or any child can have the same, if not outcome, at least chance at a fair, healthy, safe, productive life as any other child. For me, that's the measure. I think big picture, that's going to take not only a national action on income inequality and inequality in general, but also direct reparations, I believe, to Black Americans.
I want to talk about that in a moment and just how that would work. Nikita, you cover social services as a beat in New York City in particular. We're talking about now racism as a public health crisis. The fact that this is not just a matter of abstraction, but something that actually affects the public health and affects it for everyone. So is that a way of addressing it? One of the things that impressed me enormously studying as a student was Jacob Riis in the 1890s saying that it wasn't until conscience merged with self-interest that things actually got improved. When people realized it was in their own self-interest to make things better for everyone else, that the country actually addressed things like clearing up the slums and addressing problems of poverty. So if you look at racism as a public health crisis, is that likely to change the approach of people in general, Nikita?
Well, if I guess I look at it through the lens of social services, there are there's racism. Mara has actually written about, for example, the police harassment of people just going to get public assistance to get their food stamps. And in terms of, you know, one of the things that I immediately think of when I think about how racism affects a public policy, it's really, for me, when I look at the homeless shelters in New York City, the problem often is because the people who are in the shelters are Black and brown. So a community, you know, unfortunately there are these stereotypes out there, particularly about Black men. And so, you know, you'll tell a neighborhood, we want to put a shelter for single men. And automatically they're like, oh, okay, well, there will be 100 Black men in this neighborhood. And yes, there are other issues, you know, that unfortunately come, mental illness, substance abuse, etc. But that is definitely not all people who are in shelters. In fact, the overwhelming majority are not. And so, you know, it is going to take this kind of, as Mara was saying, this will, this, you know, I can't stress enough in reporting the story about whether or not this is currently a trend of, if you really sit down and talk to some white protesters, their lives at home are very different than the lives that I guess they're kind of fighting for in the streets. There has to be a word for the liberals who, you know, do as I say, not as I do.
Is the word hypocrisy?
The word is definitely hypocrisy.
I mean, I've also found that, and I hope this isn't still true, and I don't want to be cynical, but the polls cited earlier, people tend to lie on polls about race. And, you know, that may be skewing a lot of what we're seeing right now. John Eligon, you have written about the fact that you were among the people in Ferguson after Michael Brown Jr. was fatally shot by white police. And there was some blowback when, in a fairly sympathetic piece about Michael Brown, you referred to him as no angel. So how do we deal with the backlash to what some people see as an excess when people talk about defunding or abolishing the police or wiping out, knocking down statues of George Washington because he owned slaves. I mean, these are things that certainly could be debated. But when we see things, no pun intended, in black and white and not looking at the gray areas, how do we deal with that? How do you as a journalist deal with people saying, you described Brown as no angel when in fact you meant that description because it was true?
Well, I think there's a couple separate things going on there. First of all, as journalists, when we do get criticism, when we do get backlash, I think it's incumbent upon us to come to that with humility, and to look at it and to understand why that backlash is and why people are upset about things, and to really learn from it, right? Because I think part of it is being accountable to our readers, and that's something that's always happened in journalism, but it's to a different degree now. I think now that we're more accessible to readers through social media platforms. So I think it's not, you don't necessarily recoil from it, you don't get defensive, but you understand, you learn, and then you try to kind of move forward. Because I think that's one thing that's really different in this moment of activism that we've seen, is that people want, they want moral clarity. They want to be heard in a way that they haven't been heard before. Because oftentimes, with Black Lives Matter, what I remember people talking about in Ferguson when it came about is that it means that every Black life matters, whether that be a Black person who is a journalist or a lawyer, or that be a Black person who is a janitor or a school teacher, that there's this sense that come as you are, and everyone gets accepted. So I think we need to have a certain humility about that. And to the second piece, when you talk about defunding and toppling statues, and whether that's radical or whether that's going over the top, first of all, I'd say that there is actually very varied opinion within Black communities themselves about this question of defunding, right? So not, oftentimes Black people are often painted as a monolith. We know that we're not, but I think that it's very important to understand that people who may come from a certain lens about the police and saying that we don't want the police around might be envisioning a world that a lot of us can't really envision right now. How can you envision a world without police when that's all we've ever known? Mm-hmm. That this radical thinking, again, I think it's incumbent upon people to put themselves in other people's shoes. And I'll just give one quick example. I went around North Minneapolis, which is the predominantly Black part of town, and I was talking to people just randomly about defunding and what they think of the police. And the first couple of people I talked to, immediately they were like, we don't really call the police anyways because we don't feel like they protect us. One woman I talked to, she called the police once because she was in a domestic violence situation, and they ended up arresting her. And so when you think of it from that lens, maybe me sitting in my privileged seat, maybe you sitting in your privileged seat, calling the police to expect a certain outcome. So it seems like, why would we not want to have that? But if you're sitting in a different seat where calling the police could mean you get in trouble, you get locked up, you get killed, then it suddenly is not that radical that you'd want to defund the police.
Also, it's fascinating when people talk about the backlash to protests. It occurred to me the other day when I read the story about the defense secretary going so far as to say, this is 160 years or more after the end of the Civil War, saying that, no, we can't say we're going to ban Confederate flags in barracks because that might offend the President of the United States. We're only going to say what kind of flags are authorized. This is 160, is it, years after 180 years after the Civil War, and we have to beat around the bush because we don't want to offend the president about banning the Confederate flag. No wonder people are pissed off. Maren, let me ask you about reparations. How, assuming that's a good idea, assuming that people deserve that, assuming that in principle it even makes sense, how would it work?
Yeah, first of all, this is $1 million question, and it's something that I just started thinking about personally, just even practically speaking. How would you roll that out? To me, it's a fun thought exercise, and I hope it turns into something more than a thought exercise in the coming years. So I don't have any magic bullet solution here. But I do feel strongly about a few things. One is that I really believe, in addition to a large-scale program, to have a large-scale anti-poverty program in the United States for everyone and to fight income inequality for everyone, we need separately reparations for the descendants of the Black descendants of slaves in the United States. I believe that. I mean, I think that one way to think about it is how to really increase the wealth of Black families and of Black individuals. And there are different ways. So it's actually fairly simple and straightforward to determine, who was a descendant or is a descendant of an enslaved person. That's probably the easier part. The harder part is who gets what, why, how big is the pot, what's the backlash from other disadvantaged Americans? How do you account for that? But I really do believe that it's really going to be necessary, specifically for Black Americans, if we're to make up for the centuries of disadvantage and, frankly, also plunder that the community has experienced.
Please come back when you have an answer. Mara Gay of the New York Times, John Eligon, Nikita Stewart of the Times, also the author of Troop 6000. Thank you all for joining us on this enlightening discussion. And for the New York Times and CUNY TV, I am Sam Roberts.